The screech of the metal wheels against the rusted tracks was the only thing keeping me from falling into a deep sleep. But the moment the train lurched to a sudden, violent halt between stations, the silence that followed was far more terrifying than the noise. I looked across the aisle at the young girl who had been sitting there just moments ago, her bright yellow backpack still resting on the seat and her phone still plugged into the wall outlet with the charging light blinking like a tiny, rhythmic heartbeat. But the seat itself was empty and the air in the carriage suddenly felt unnaturally cold. We were deep underground, trapped in the belly of the city where the cell service was a distant memory and the emergency lights flickered with a rhythmic, sickly yellow pulse that made the shadows dance along the walls in a way that seemed almost predatory. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I called out her name into the stagnant air. But the only response was the distant, muffled sound of something heavy dragging across the metal roof of the train right above my head. Why would she leave her bag and her phone behind in a world where those things are a teenager's entire life? And how could she have vanished from a moving train without me hearing a single scream or the heavy groan of the manual doors that lead between the cars? I moved toward the end of the carriage, my boots clicking loudly on the linoleum floor with a sound that seemed to echo for miles in the quiet tunnel, and I peered through the small, reinforced glass window into the next car, hoping to see her standing there or perhaps talking to a conductor who could explain why we had stopped. The next car was completely dark, the power seemingly cut off entirely as if a fuse had been pulled by a deliberate hand, and as I pressed my face against the cold glass, I saw a single muddy handprint slide down the interior of the door before disappearing into the thick gloom. My hand trembled as I reached for the heavy iron handle, wondering if I was walking into a trap or if I was truly the only person left who could save her from whatever was lurking in the dark, forgotten tunnels of the 4th Street line. The door groaned with a high-pitched metal shriek as I forced it open, the smell of ozone and old grease filling my lungs and making me cough, and I stepped into the darkness of the second carriage while the entire train groaned as if it were a living thing settling into a shallow grave. I pulled out my small keychain flashlight, the weak beam cutting a tiny, pathetic hole in the oppressive blackness, and that was when I saw the trail of damp footprints leading toward the very back of the train where the maintenance hatch in the floor was swung wide open. As I crept further into the dark, I kept asking myself if I should just stay put and wait for the transit police to find us, but then I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from beneath the floorboards, a frantic and irregular SOS that could only be coming from someone trapped in the mechanical void below. The realization that she was being held in the narrow, cramped crawl space beneath the passenger seats made my blood turn to ice, especially when I realized the tapping was being answered by a low, melodic whistling coming from the very back of the car where the shadows were the thickest. I crouched down, dousing my light so I wouldn't be an easy target for whoever was watching me from the dark, and I crawled along the center aisle on my hands and knees, my eyes straining to catch any movement in the peripheral of the dim, red emergency exit signs. I could hear the sound of heavy breathing now, the kind of wet, labored breath that belongs to someone who has been waiting in the dark for a very long time, and I realized with a sudden jolt of horror that I wasn't the hunter in this scenario, but the prey that had walked right into the middle of a web. Every muscle in my body told me to run, to scream for help, to break a window and climb into the soot-covered tunnels. But the tapping beneath my feet grew more desperate and frantic, and I knew I couldn't leave her to face this shadow alone in the dark. Suddenly, the train's power flickered back on for a split second, a blinding flash of white light that revealed a man standing at the end of the aisle, his face covered by a tattered gray hood and his hands gripping a heavy industrial wrench that looked stained with something dark and slick. He didn't move, he didn't speak. He just stared at me with eyes that reflected the flickering light like a predator in the wild. And then the darkness swallowed us both again as the fuses blew for the final time with a loud pop and the smell of burning wire. I scrambled backward, my hands searching frantically for anything to use as a weapon, and I felt the cold, hard metal of a fire extinguisher housing against my spine, a small spark of hope in the middle of a living nightmare. I heard his heavy boots hitting the floor, a slow and deliberate pace that suggested he knew exactly where I was, and that he was enjoying the terror he was radiating into the cramped, airless space of the train car. "Where is she?" I croaked out, my voice sounding small and fragile in the vastness of the tunnel. But the only answer I received was the sound of the wrench striking a metal pole, a ringing tone that vibrated through my very teeth and made my head spin. I knew I had to move now or I would never move again, so I rolled to the left onto the hard floor just as the heavy metal tool smashed into the seat where my head had been a second before, the sound of tearing vinyl and breaking plastic echoing like a gunshot through the silence. I didn't stop to think. I just swung the heavy fire extinguisher with every bit of strength I had left in my shaking arms, feeling the solid, bone-jarring impact against his ribs and hearing the satisfying guttural grunt of pain as he tumbled backward into the darkness. I reached down to the maintenance hatch, my fingers fumbling with the rusted latch until I managed to heave it open, revealing the terrified, wide eyes of the girl who had vanished, her mouth covered with silver duct tape and her wrists bound tightly with heavy plastic zip ties. I hauled her out of the hole with a strength I didn't know I possessed, her weight nearly pulling me down into the gap. But the sound of the man scrambling back to his feet and hissing in rage gave me the massive adrenaline surge I needed to keep moving. We couldn't go back through the train because he was blocking the path, so I shoved her toward the emergency release handle on the side door, praying that the manual override hadn't been sabotaged or locked from the outside. The door gave way with a loud hiss of escaping air and a mechanical thud, and we tumbled out onto the narrow, slippery concrete catwalk of the tunnel, the smell of damp earth and ancient dust filling our senses as we began to run toward the distant, flickering glow of the next station. Behind us, I could hear the heavy thud of the man jumping down from the train car, his boots hitting the gravel with a sound that told me he was already closing the gap and that he wasn't going to let us reach the light easily. The tunnel was a labyrinth of deep shadows, dripping pipes, and high-voltage wires that hummed with a dangerous energy, and every time I looked back, I could see the silhouette of his hooded figure passing under the dim maintenance lights like a relentless shadow that refused to let its prey escape. My lungs were burning with the cold, dusty air, and the girl was stumbling beside me, her breath coming in ragged, terrified sobs, but I refused to let go of her hand because I knew that if we stopped for even a moment, the darkness of the tunnel would claim us both and we would never be seen again. We finally reached a rusted service ladder that led up toward a sidewalk grate, the faint, beautiful sound of city traffic and distant sirens filtering down from above like a heavenly choir. I pushed her up the ladder first, shouting for her to keep going, and I glanced back to see the man reaching the base of the steel rungs, his hand outstretched to grab my ankle with a grip that felt like a cold iron vise. I kicked out with all my might, my heavy boot catching him squarely in the chest and sending him reeling back into the darkness of the tracks where the shadows seemed to swallow him whole, giving me just enough time to scramble up the remaining steps. We burst through the heavy iron grate and onto the rainy street, the cold, fresh air hitting my face like a blessing, and I didn't stop running until I saw the bright neon lights of a 24-hour diner and the comforting sight of normal people living their normal lives. We collapsed onto the wet sidewalk, safe at last, while the police arrived minutes later to search the tunnels, though they would later tell me that they found the train completely empty and the man was nowhere to be found. Even now, I can't ride the subway without looking at the dark maintenance hatches on the floor, wondering if he is still down there in the dark, waiting for the next girl to sit in the wrong seat at the end of the night. The silver flash of the knife in the moonlight was the last thing I expected to see through my apartment window, but the sight of my neighbor being dragged into a black van by two men in tactical gear made my heart stop and my breath hitch in my throat. I ducked behind the curtain, my hands shaking so violently that I nearly dropped my phone, and I watched through a tiny gap as the van sped away, leaving the street as silent and empty as a graveyard at midnight. I didn't think. I just dialed the emergency number, my voice cracking as I told the operator exactly what I had seen. But the calm, almost bored tone of the person on the other end should have been my first warning that something was terribly wrong. They told me to stay exactly where I was and that an officer was already in the area, but less than 3 minutes later, a dark sedan pulled up to my curb without any sirens or flashing lights, and a man in a crisp blue uniform stepped out and began walking toward my front door with a heavy, purposeful stride. He didn't look like the police officers I usually saw patrolling the neighborhood. His uniform was just a little too clean and his eyes were cold and vacant, searching the windows of my house with a predatory intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I met him at the door, my finger hovering over the lock, and he flashed a badge so quickly, I couldn't even read the name before he leaned in and asked if I was the one who had called about the disturbance down the street. I started to explain what I saw, but he kept interrupting me with strange questions about whether I had recorded the incident or if I had told anyone else what I witnessed, his hand resting firmly on the grip of his holster the entire time. "We need you to come down to the station to sign a formal statement immediately," he said, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register that didn't sound like a request at all. And he reached out to take my arm with a grip that was far too tight to be professional. I pulled back, a surge of adrenaline hitting my system as I realized there were no other police cars on the street and the dispatcher hadn't even hung up the phone yet. But when I looked down at my screen, the call had been disconnected by a remote signal. "I'll follow you there in my own car," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but the look he gave me was one of pure, calculated malice as he blocked the doorway and told me that wasn't an option for security reasons. I slammed the door and threw the deadbolt just as his heavy boot crashed against the wood, the sound echoing through my quiet house like a thunderclap and sending a shower of splinters across the entryway floor. I ran for the back stairs, my mind racing through every possible escape route, while the sound of the front door being kicked off its hinges told me that he wasn't alone and that the police were now inside my home. I scrambled into the basement, the only place left to hide, and I ducked behind a stack of old moving crates just as I heard the heavy thud of multiple sets of boots hitting the floorboards directly above my head. The basement was pitch black and smelled of damp concrete and laundry detergent, and I could hear them whispering to each other, their voices distorted by the floorboards but dripping with a cold, professional efficiency that made me realize these weren't just common criminals. She saw the face. One of them hissed, his voice vibrating through the vents. "And we can't have a witness walking around when the van is already halfway to the warehouse." I realized then that my neighbor wasn't just missing. She had been erased, and now I was the next piece of evidence that they needed to dispose of before the sun came up. I saw the beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the cracks in the basement door, the light sweeping across the room and highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden ghosts. I held my breath until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, pressing my back against the cold stone wall and praying that the shadows would be thick enough to swallow me whole while the footsteps slowly descended the wooden stairs. Each creak of the wood sounded like a scream in the silence, and I watched as a pair of polished black boots stepped into my field of vision, the man moving with a slow, rhythmic pace that suggested he was enjoying the hunt. He stopped just inches from my hiding spot, the tip of his boot touching the edge of the crate, and I saw him reach into his pocket to pull out a pair of heavy, industrial-grade zip ties that glinted in the faint light. My hand found a heavy glass jar of old nails on the shelf beside me, and as he started to lean over to peer behind the boxes, I threw it with every ounce of strength I had toward the far corner of the room. The sound of the glass shattering against the furnace was enough of a distraction to make him spin around, and in that split second of confusion, I bolted from behind the crates and sprinted toward the small, rectangular coal window at the top of the foundation. I scrambled up the workbench, my fingers clawing at the rusted latch until it gave way with a painful snap, and I squeezed my body through the narrow opening just as a hand grabbed at the heel of my shoe. I kicked back blindly, feeling my foot connect with something soft, and I heard a muffled curse as I tumbled out onto the wet grass of my backyard and into the freezing night air. I didn't head for the street where their car was waiting. Instead, I jumped the fence into the dense woods that bordered the local park, my bare feet stinging as I ran over thorns and jagged rocks in the total darkness. I could hear them crashing through the brush behind me, their flashlights dancing through the trees like angry fireflies, but I knew these woods better than anyone, and I knew exactly where the old maintenance tunnel was hidden beneath the bridge. I slid down the muddy embankment and crawled into the narrow concrete pipe, the sound of my own frantic breathing echoing off the walls as I pushed myself deeper into the darkness where the light couldn't reach. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the men calling out to each other in the woods above, their voices growing more frustrated and distant as the minutes ticked by and the first light of dawn began to gray the sky. They eventually gave up, the sound of the sedan's engine fading away into the distance, But I didn't move until I heard the unmistakable sound of a real police siren and the chatter of a radio that wasn't being scrambled by a jammer. I crawled out of the pipe, covered in mud and shivering from the cold, and I ran toward the lights of a patrol car that had been dispatched to investigate the report of a break-in at my address. It turned out that the men were part of a high-level kidnapping ring that had been using stolen uniforms to silence witnesses, and if I hadn't jumped through that window, I would have vanished just like the girl next door. They never found my neighbor, but her backpack was found in the back of a discarded sedan 3 towns over. A chilling reminder that sometimes the person coming to save you is the one you should be running from. The heavy wooden door of the mountain cabin groaned on its hinges as I pushed it open, the scent of cedar and old floor wax filling my nose. But despite the beautiful view of the valley below, a cold shiver traced its way down my spine the moment I stepped inside. My best friend, Maya, had been so excited about this weekend getaway, posting photos of the sunset to her social media just an hour before she told me she was going to take a quick walk to the creek. But that was 3 hours ago, and her hiking boots were still sitting right by the front door. I stood in the center of the living room, the silence of the forest pressing against the windows like a physical weight, and I noticed that her phone was lying face down on the kitchen island, buzzing incessantly with notifications that she would never normally ignore. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass or overturned furniture, yet the house felt different than it had when we arrived, as if the very geometry of the hallways had shifted while my back was turned. I called her name, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the vast, vaulted ceiling of the cabin, but the only answer was the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner that seemed to be counting down to something I wasn't prepared to face. I walked toward the master bedroom, my socks sliding silently over the polished wood, and I noticed a thin, jagged line in the wallpaper that didn't quite match the floral pattern near the heavy oak wardrobe. My heart skipped a beat as I pressed my hand against the wall, feeling a slight vibration and a faint draft of cold, metallic-smelling air blowing through a gap that shouldn't have been there. With a sharp tug, a section of the wall swung inward on hidden, well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow, pitch-black passageway that smelled of damp earth and stale cigarette smoke. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the handle, and I stepped into the darkness of the crawl space, my phone's flashlight illuminating a row of small, circular holes drilled into the back of the bedroom walls. I realized with a jolt of pure terror that these were peepholes, perfectly positioned to watch every move we made in the house, and as I followed the narrow path deeper into the guts of the building, I saw a chair bolted to the floor in front of a monitor that was still glowing with a grainy, live feed of the very room I had just left. The realization that our host hadn't just been friendly, but had been stalking our every move from inside the walls made me want to vomit. But then I heard a muffled, rhythmic thumping coming from further down the passage, beneath the floorboards of the guest bathroom. I dropped to my knees, shining my light through the floor joists, and I saw Maya's pale face staring back at me from a cramped utility cellar, her eyes wide with a level of fear I hoped to never see again. Before I could reach for the latch, the sound of a heavy footstep echoed from the end of the passage behind me, and the light from my phone caught the reflection of a pair of thick, wire-rimmed glasses and a hunting knife that looked far too sharp to be for skinning deer. It was the owner of the cabin, the man who had checked us in with a shaky smile and trembling hands. But now his face was a mask of cold, calculated aggression as he blocked the only exit from the secret hallway. "You weren't supposed to find the door," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very timber of the house. "And now I can't let either of you leave this mountain." I didn't wait for him to move. I swung the heavy iron poker at the nearest light fixture, plunging us both into total, suffocating darkness while I scrambled backward toward the cellar latch where Maya was trapped. I could hear him breathing, a heavy, wet sound that told me he was moving toward me by touch, his boots scraping against the narrow wooden slats of the crawl space with a terrifying persistence. I found the bolt to the cellar and yanked it back, my fingernails tearing against the metal, and I hauled Maya up into the passage just as the blade of the hunting knife hissed through the air where my shoulder had been a second before. We scrambled through the narrow exit and back into the bedroom, slamming the hidden door shut and shoving the heavy oak wardrobe in front of it with a strength fueled by pure, unadulterated survival instinct. We could hear him screaming and throwing his weight against the wood from the other side, the wardrobe rocking precariously as he tried to break back into the living space of the house. We ran for the front door, but the sound of a heavy chain being pulled tight from the outside told me that he had already prepared for our escape, locking us into our own personal prison while he worked his way through the walls. The sun had completely disappeared behind the peaks, leaving the cabin bathed in a sickly blue moonlight that made every shadow look like a reaching hand, and I knew we had to find another way out before he found a different hidden door into the room. We ran to the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps moving through the ceiling above us now, and I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet, telling Maya to grab the fire axe from the emergency cabinet near the pantry. We didn't head for the windows, which were reinforced with decorative iron bars, but instead, we headed for the small laundry room which had a narrow plastic pet door that led out to the back deck. It was a tight squeeze, and every second we spent struggling through the opening felt like an eternity while we heard the wardrobe in the bedroom finally tip over with a deafening crash. I pushed Maya through first, her jacket snagging on a jagged piece of plastic, and I followed right behind her just as the laundry room door was kicked open by the man, his face contorted in a silent, murderous rage. We tumbled onto the wooden deck and didn't stop to look back, sprinting toward the dense treeline where the shadows of the pines offered the only hope of concealment from his high-powered spotlight. We spent the next 4 hours navigating the treacherous, rocky terrain in total silence, freezing every time a branch snapped or an owl took flight, fearing that his knowledge of the land would lead him right to our throats. We finally reached the main road just as a logging truck was rumbling past, and the driver's confused expression when he saw 2 mud-covered, terrified women waving him down was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. The police raided the cabin later that night, finding a network of tunnels that connected to 3 other properties in the area. But the man had vanished into the wilderness he knew so well, leaving behind only a collection of photographs that proved we weren't the first girls to walk into his trap.